We're really very pleased to be hosting Jacob Heilbrunn, who's here to talk about his new book, America Last, the right's century-long romance with foreign dictators. Jacob edits the foreign policy magazine, The National Interest, and has been a close observer for a number of years of the American right. His previous book, a decade and a half ago, They Knew They Were Right, traced the rise of the neocons who came to have so much influence, particularly in the George W. Bush administration, and helped to lead the U.S. into the war with Iraq. Jacob's new book explores the rather puzzling, at least to some of us, admiration shown by American conservatives toward foreign dictators. This has been very much in evidence, of course, in recent years, for instance, in Donald Trump's embrace of Russia's Putin and China's Xi and North Korea's Kim, or in the adulation of Hungary's Orbán by such right-wing American groups as the Heritage Foundation or the Conservative Political Action Conference. But the phenomenon actually isn't all that new, as Jacob recounts. He cites antecedents as far back as World War I, when some intellectuals on the right expressed a hankering for such authoritarian leaders abroad as Kaiser Wilhelm II. And in the 1920s and 1930s, this affinity became even more pronounced as Hitler and Mussolini attracted prominent American admirers like William Randolph Hearst, Charles Lindbergh, and Henry Ford. Throughout the Cold War, Jacob recalls, the right evinced a fondness for such autocrats as Franco and Pinochet, while some conservatives wrote apologias for the Third Reich and apartheid South Africa. So why this recurring pro-authoritarian tendency in elite conservative circles over the past century? Well, Jacob contends it's in part because these strong men are viewed by the right as models of how to fight against liberalism and progressivism domestically. It also reflects, Jacob says, the right's deep-rooted emotional commitment to hierarchy, order, family, traditional gender roles, and some notion of racial, cultural, or religious purity. Jacob's book is very well researched. It's very timely, and it's written in a very lively style with apt vignettes and anecdotes. So anyone interested in better understanding what's happening on the right, which should be all of us, should read America Last. In conversation with Jacob this evening will be Susan Glasser, a veteran for the New Yorker. Now, we have lots of moderators, as you know, and I'm not supposed to play favorites. And I won't, but let me just say we're really pleased to also have Susan here tonight. She's the best. As you know, if you follow her work in the New Yorker, she writes about a lot of subjects and has over the years in her other reporting positions. Some years ago, when working for the Washington Post, she spent time in Moscow as a foreign correspondent along with her journalist husband, Peter Baker. She subsequently co-wrote a book with Peter about Putin's rise, and has also co-authored an excellent biography of former Secretary of State James Baker, and most recently co-authored a book with Peter about Trump's term as president. The book's called The Divider. Anyway, please join me in welcoming Jacob and Susan.
Well, of course, I want to thank Brad. And if we're not supposed to have favorite moderators, we're not supposed to have favorite bookstore owners either. But we all know that Politics and Prose is a great Washington institution, and we're lucky to have it. So thank you, Brad. And I have to say, this is really a treat for me because, there's a lot of books we're all drowning in historical analogies for understanding the Trump era and whatnot. But this is I've already read it, and I can tell you it's a terrific and very valuable book. And it is different than a lot of the other books that I've read. And having spent a lot of time over the last 8 years, as we all have, trying to wrestle with how this seeming outlier of a moment could have come to pass, looking for historical antecedents for it, trying to understand, are we just doomed to be, arguing with each other over, whether this is a repeat of the 1930s or not, until the very moment at which we all become sure one way or the other. I liked this book because it took me outside of that by now familiar doom loop and introduced me to new doom loops. But no, seriously, one of the values, Jacob, is that you introduce us, I think, to characters, stories, and a long thread of history that has been all too much, kind of forgotten or just left by the wayside. And it finally made sense to me in a way that it really hadn't reading some other books, because Jacob takes the story back to, earlier than the 1930s, earlier than, kind of this quickie version of America firstism, didn't start with Trump, that we're all familiar with, and goes back to World War I, actually, and even before World War I. And, the German that this book starts with is actually not Adolf Hitler, whom Americans were admiring. It is the Kaiser, and by the way, who knew the Kaiser was such a bad guy? I really appreciate you bringing it back to that. But, so we'll just jump into the conversation, but I do, it's not fair for the author to have to do all the work of shamelessly plugging his own book. So I will shamelessly plug the book and say that you really should read it. It's really an excellent read. And so, Jacob, I want to start before we get into, this kind of disturbing intellectual history. Why did you write this book? Again, I personally appreciate that you did, because it helped me to think about this kind of disturbing moment we're living in. But how did you come on to this? Because it is personal at points that we'll get into, actually.
The reason I wrote it is I got an email from an editor at The Atlantic, which is right around the corner from here, who I'd written a bunch of pieces for the New York Review of Books about Trump, about Tucker Carlson, and then he moved to The Atlantic, and he said he had a harebrained idea for an article that I knew would be a total disaster. So I said, I'd been sort of, I'd followed the right, obviously, for a long time, and I thought, well, maybe there's an interesting piece to be written looking back at the history of this. And so I did, 1,500, 1,800 word piece for The Atlantic. I thought, oh, well, that's it. Then I got a couple months later out of the blue as I was exercising from an editor at Norton, and he said, do you want to turn it into a book? And I said, sure. And then he said, well, we would need it in 10 to 12 weeks. And I have had a lot of journalistic training, and I had to write a lot at the New Republic quickly, so I said, fine. And
by the way, I can say as someone who's assigned Jacob pieces, he is really fast.
I'm not sure I should be disclosing this, but I actually did not know great chunks of this story. I had to research and write at the same time. And I have a strong background in German history, German literature, partly because I grew up speaking German. Both my parents were born, as I point out in the epilogue, in Nazi Germany. I still have some relatives in Germany, so I had an intimate familiarity with that. And that sort of serves as the backdrop to this book. Now, if you're a conservative, conservatives are always complaining that they're being called, have complained for decades that they're being called fascists, or that there's too much focus on the Nazi era and so forth. So I'm just saying that was the backdrop that I had as I wrote this book, and that's how I came to write it.
And yet, what's amazing to me is that, I mean, that makes it even more amazing, the accomplishment of the book. Because trust me, you would not know that if he had not just told you the story. But what's interesting as far as the F word goes in this book is that you actually show that it both predates and postdates Nazi Germany, that the American right's preoccupation with and sort of elevation of foreign autocrats is not something out of a fever dream out of Donald Trump's mind, but whatever their particular brand of right-wing nationalism or authoritarianism doesn't matter so much, right? Like that it's not specific to some kind of preoccupation with the totalitarian leaders of Italy and Germany in World War II, right? Like, and I think that is a contribution in and of itself. But yet, obviously, we wouldn't all be here if it weren't so relevant to today. So before we get into some of the history stuff, I mean, first of all, did you pay Tucker Carlson to go on that trip? It's like a blurb, it's like a blurb for the book. What do you think? Where does he fit into the characters that you write about in this book?
What is interesting is that many of these contemporary Tucker Carlson, Michael Flynn, they all have their cognates. Tucker Carlson reminds me in many ways of H.L. Mencken. He's not as intelligent, but he shares many of the same views. General Michael Flynn reminds me, there was a general in 1938 named George Van Horn Moseley. Moseley was an outright fascist. And one of the things that I try to stress in the book is that we may not have heard of these people. I wasn't really aware of Moseley before, but these were people. Moseley, for example, testified before Congress several times, was on the front page of the New York Times. He was a well-known figure in the United States. And he called for sterilizing any Jewish refugees that arrived in America. He wanted the president he wanted the military to be employed to crush socialists in America. I mean, it's very similar, the conspiratorial thinking. A lot of these, I talk about a famous New York financier at the time named Merwin Hart, who appears regularly in the New York Times in the 30s and 40s. And he believed that, that Jewish refugees were communists, were subversives who had congregated in Manhattan, and that this was why Americans needed to exercise their Second Amendment rights. We needed to arm ourselves against this pressing threat. Now, obviously, these people are, we would view them as lunatics today, but the Roosevelt administration did take them seriously. There was a speech by Attorney General Robert Jackson in 1940 in which he explicitly talked about these people and talked about democracy on fire and the fact that the United States faced an internal threat to its democracy. He said, you might think I'm going to talk about abroad. I'm not. I'm talking about what's happening right inside the United States. And interesting, I just think a lot of this history has been forgotten or overshadowed.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And, it wasn't for me until Trump came to office in 2017 that I started reading more about the first America First movement. But again, even then, I feel like your book is original in that it takes the timeline farther back. H.L. Mencken, as you mentioned, is, you might have still heard of him, but you probably didn't associate him with, kind of apologism, if not cheerleading for the German side in World War I. So, I feel like that alone, helps to contextualize it in a much broader picture of the American right than having it be so specific to World War II. Of course, there's also members of Congress all along the way, both in the First World War and the Second World War, in not a dissimilar way, too. I was thinking of J.D. Vance going to the Munich Security Conference over the weekend to sort of thumb Europe's nose in his, kind of cheerleading for Putin. Why do you think the origins of this are, though? Are they fundamentally about a view of the world, or are they about a view of America? Because that's another part of your thesis that I find pretty provocative, which is that it's actually it's part of the right's critique of what's happening here in the country that leads them down the road to elevating and exalting foreign dictators and thugs.
Right. The reason that I begin with World War I, and it is because the defenses were, H.L. Mencken and others in the United States admired Prussian autocracy. Now, it sounds like a historical curiosity, but then when you start looking at it, so Prussia was the premier illiberal state in Central Europe at that time. And why is Mencken defending it? Well, because he harbored grave reservations about democracy in the United States. He viewed himself as a Nietzschean, and he feared the mob. He did not like the rabble. He was essentially an elitist. So he actually wrote articles for The Atlantic calling for Prussia to conquer the United States, and that this would lead to a better society here. Now, why is that relevant? Well, there was a book in the 1980s that came out called Political Pilgrims, and that was a history of left-wing socialists who traveled to the Soviet Union or Mao's China and saw that as a foreign utopia. And I see this phenomenon as similar. The idea is that there is a society abroad, an authoritarian or even totalitarian society that represents a better model than the American system. And that's what I think we are facing.
See also the epic debunking of Tucker Carlson's trip to the Moscow metro this week and a supermarket in Moscow, which is very much in the tradition of the political pilgrims that you're talking about. I believe he goes through the supermarket, which, by the way, is a French chain. It is actually a branch of Auchan. When he's in the middle of the supermarket, he says, "I am filled with revulsion for my country because the price of bread in Moscow is cheaper than it is in wherever it is that he lives." So it's very much in keeping with a long tradition there.
Exactly. And back then they were called fellow travelers, or you can use the word political pilgrim. It is almost a
That sounds awfully generous, I have to say, political pilgrim. You know, I feel like I'm like thinking of dudes in like white hats and, black hats and white collars.
It is in some ways it's a romanticization of a foreign society, and that's what's going on with Hungary today and Victor Orbán. So a lot of people at the Heritage Foundation, they admire the family values, and I saw that they believe that Hungary is espousing, and the opposition to immigration in Hungary. And I saw that one of Heritage Foundation member today called for a ban on recreational sex in the United States. So there is this, again, I would say authoritarian impulse. It all sounds weird, but
That
it is
part's
out there.
probably likely to remain a minority viewpoint. I'm just going to go out on a limb and say, but
it's
Donald Trump is not getting behind that campaign platform. Let's be real.
fair enough.
Mike Pence, maybe. But Hungary is a really interesting example. And of course, both Orbán and Putin have almost in an explicit way courted the support and connections with the American right by emphasizing these kind of culture war issues, things like opposition to LGBTQ rights or, that we're going to be a Christian nationalist kind of country. How much was that true in the kind of pre-war iterations of this movement in the United States? Was that already was there a 1918 version of the culture wars that was playing out, or was it motivated by different issues?
I don't think it was a culture war during World War I. There was a desire to protect German identity. We had a substantial German-American population in the United States. I think it does become...
Including Donald Trump's father.
I think in the 1920s. It's in the 1920s, interestingly, that it starts to take off. There was an ambassador that Warren Harding sent over to Italy named Richard Washburn Child, who wrote for the Saturday Evening Post and was an ambassador during Mussolini's ascension to power. And he praised Mussolini for cracking down on hedonism, in contrast to the United States. The United States was weak and effeminate, whereas Mussolini represented masculine virility. And that's an interesting theme that I thought came out. As far as the America First movement, again, I don't think that these cultural themes, except as far as they lapse into anti-Semitism. I mean, if you view that as that is in a way a cultural issue too.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Hitler's idea of, kinder culture, that was related to a kind of a idea about cleansing German culture, right? Seemed to have an appeal here in the U.S. But the conventional narrative that I was familiar with before this book, and certainly before the last few years, was essentially that, World War II purged the Republican Party of these isolationists, that they were, the predominant part of the Republican Party before World War II, that their views, Lindbergh, Senator Taft from Ohio, were discredited fundamentally by what happened in World War II, and that essentially the post-war consensus was one that encompassed Republicans and Democrats. You tell a more nuanced story about that, though, which is that that makes much more sense to me. Because otherwise, how do you account for McCarthyism? How do you account for some of the policies of the Republican Party in the 50s and 60s? Tell us a little bit to explain what happened there. Did Republicans, by and large, give up isolationism for a period of time? Was it discredited and then something made it come back, or what's your view?
I think it mutated after World War II. It's interesting, in 1944, Colonel Robert McCormick, who was the head of the Chicago Tribune and a virulent isolationist, set up this publication called Human Events, and out of that came Regnery Press. And Regnery Press, a lot of these right-wing figures from the pre-war gathered around it, and it published a number of books denouncing the establishment of Israel, and they published books stating that the war crimes perpetrated by the United States were as bad or worse than those committed by the Nazis. And Senator Joseph McCarthy, when he enters the Senate, is looking for an issue. The first thing he does is pick up this case that had taken, in 1944, SS troops, the Adolf Hitler Division, murdered 100 GIs or more. And there was a trial after the war. And the defense prosecutor was embarrassed by the fact that he had lost the case and these soldiers were convicted of these crimes. What happened was there was a brouhaha in which the soldiers alleged that they had been tortured and forced into these confessions by the War Department. So there was an investigation in the Senate, and McCarthy jumped onto it and defended these SS soldiers. He called them innocent GI Joes. And it's really a remarkable episode because, in these Senate hearings, he said, would you want to be interrogated by a man named Rosenfeld? And he referred to them as 39ers. It's terrible stuff. And this case then was the first instance of McCarthy going after the War Department and then the Pentagon, and going after the military, which he did. Now, the case blew over. But then the right, all these figures are still there, but they turn to a different authoritarian leader that they back, and that I think provides an avenue out of isolationism. And that is Chiang Kai-shek, who is perched in Taiwan. So what's the new argument? The argument is that those liberals who sold out the United States at Yalta and allowed Stalin to take over are now culpable for the loss of China in 1948. And so it became an Asia First movement. And the idea was that if you only armed Chiang Kai-shek enough, he could topple the communist forces.
And this is another really amazing thing that just helped me to understand something I have been at an absolute loss for the last year or so, which is in the present day, a whole strand of Republican thinking arguing basically a modern day equivalent of Asia First, and saying, well, we shouldn't help Ukraine in its fight against Russia, and really we shouldn't bother about Russia at all, and we shouldn't bother about NATO. We should focus exclusively on the challenge that China poses to the United States and on the defense of Taiwan. This is very represented probably most prominently by a foreign policy guy named Elbridge Colby here in Washington, but it's really become an increasing strand on the right. You see senators like Josh Hawley and others glomming onto it, and it's almost a direct echo of your chapter on this from the immediate post-World War II era.
Right. I'm friends with Bridge Colby, and I wrote a piece about all this for Politico, which I think is I think his take, frankly, is implausible. It's that we essentially what he's saying, he doesn't say it outright, but it would be to sacrifice Ukraine, that China is the greater threat to Taiwan. I actually see it the reverse. I think Putin is attacking Ukraine right now, and we should aid it. I don't minimize the threat that China poses to Taiwan, but I don't believe that they're as reckless as Putin is behaving.
Well, what's fascinating too, of course, is wouldn't the Chinese, take from our abandonment of Ukraine essentially a green light to deal with Taiwan as it pleases, on the theory that it's a much harder military target for us to find ways to support anyways, and that it's just a fascinating echo, though. Again, looking for the through lines in this history, I think it helps to understand how this Republican Party comes out of World War II, and they're the same people who are in power, but they kind of morph their politics, and then enters characters who are more familiar to us, right? More to the present day, people like William F. Buckley. And they have a whole constellation of kind of dictators and strongmen that they end up admiring. I never understood, why do they like Franco so much? With Salazar in Portugal. There's a long list. Chile, you mentioned. Why, right? It's a little bit hard to wrap your mind around the party of Ronald Reagan and the freedom agenda. How is it freedom to be supporting people like that?
Well, Bill Buckley was the son of a fairly authoritarian Irish Catholic. His father was actually involved in the revolution in Mexico, and became convinced that the communist threat was everywhere after his experiences in Mexico. And much of Buckley's family ended up living in Franco Spain, including as well as his brother-in-law, L. Brent Bozell, who went totally off the deep end and staged actually the first violent abortion protest here in Washington, D.C. in 1969 and was arrested. Buckley had, a soft spot. NR, the National Review, had its good dictators. They also defended apartheid in South Africa. Bill Buckley wrote an editorial in 1957 explaining why African Americans should not be allowed to vote in the United States. He then modified that to say, in the early 1960s, to say that the uneducated generally should not be allowed to vote.
Which takes you right back to H.L. Mencken in some ways, right?
It does. There is an elitist strand in the conservative movement. Many of the people that we're talking about attended Ivy League universities. They're not dumb. Not everything that they're saying is implausible, which we can get into. It's not ipso facto anti-American to be an isolationist. It's actually a venerable tradition. It's just the way in the people that I'm looking at take it to a kind of extreme that I think takes you into very deep waters.
Well, there's a lot of people. I'm really glad you mentioned this, horrific kind of dance with apartheid South Africa that was clearly decades long, very negative aspect of the Republican Party, a lot of people would argue that, we're overcomplicating things, and that, there's always been a lot of racists in America, and that their racism in how they looked about our politics inside the United States colored their views of international geopolitics as well. And of course, they were in favor of an apartheid country outside of the United States because that's what they wanted inside the United States.
Yeah, I think that's correct, and I kind of allude to that in the book. I mean, Russell Kirk, who is a prominent conservative, denounced the Warren Court. He attacks, I quote him, attacking one man, one vote. A lot of these conservatives, I guess the best way to look at some of them is they're reactionaries they're obviously they're trying to conserve something, but there is this reactionary impulse. And what we're talking about, that's what we're talking about with Mencken. You're talking about the old right. And in some ways...
They eventually came to be called the paleo-conservatives, right?
Yeah. And
As in cavemen were a little bit too risque for them.
Well, Buckley is always trying to toggle between these two camps, because he does write in the early 1950s, he said, well, the battle against communism is so important that we're going to have to accept the welfare state. Now, this caused a division in the conservative movement, because people like Russell Kirk and then later Pat Buchanan, no way. They're not down with that.
Okay, so you mentioned Pat Buchanan. He is as close to a direct modern antecedent for Donald Trump ideologically as you can find. And so tell us about Pat Buchanan and where he fits in to all of this. And he resurrects the slogan "America First" for the modern era. What would he have made of Donald Trump? I mean, he's still around. He endorsed him, I believe. But really, what would he have made of him?
He likes Donald Trump. I mean, when I saw him at a party a couple of years ago, he said, "So, do you think that Donald's going to make it?" Pat Buchanan grew up again in an Irish Catholic family, very authoritarian. His father took the belt to him.
So is that, but you've mentioned this a couple times. So you have a working thesis here that sort of strong men at home lead to strong men worship in ideologically.
There is a bit of a pattern there.
I'm going to need some, social science research to back this up. But I think there is some, by the way.
I'm just giving you a surmise from looking at the way that they were raised. Buchanan, too, was raised on the idea that you use your fists. His father taught them all boxing. He put them in the ring with the neighborhood kids. The Buchanan family, the kids were notorious for their pugilistic exploits in Georgetown. Pat Buchanan was arrested at least once, if not twice, for getting into fights. So yeah, there is something going on.
And where was his ideology, would you say, sort of similar to Trump's and the MAGA catechism that we're living with now, and where did it differ?
Well, I think Buchanan is much smarter than Trump, and actually has a consistent religious belief. I think he and Trump may overlap in a tribal view of things, but Buchanan grew up. His brothers did serve in World War II, but he grew up on America First. He states all this explicitly in his memoirs. He hated globalism, the United Nations. He believed in politics as an arena of combat. And he was to the right of Nixon in some ways. He shored up the right flank when he served in the Nixon administration. Same thing in the Reagan administration. Buchanan is a guy that wrote in 1977 in a syndicated column, Adolf Hitler is a soldier. There is some latent admiration for the Nazis, and he would dispute it. But you look at his record defending all the Nazi war criminals over and over, disputing the necessity to trace down and evict Nazi war criminals from the United States, which he did in the 80s and 90s. There's something unhealthy about it. This was an element of National Review. I don't think Bill Buckley shared it, but there was another writer there named Joseph Sobran, who was even beyond Buckley. Sobran really was a Holocaust denier. So these people represent the fringe of the right.
So speaking of fringe, what would your study of history tell us about people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz and the sort of the constellation of kind of MAGA hangers-on in Congress and on Fox News, who are kind of daily litigating, the modern version of this? Would they be familiar to their kind of early World War II equivalents, or are they just a product of the modern television, social media era?
No, I mean, I think they picked up some of the rhetorical tricks. I mean, the whataboutism. And if you look at Buckley really pioneered a lot of it. He was more against than for. And if you look at his book on McCarthy, it's called McCarthy and His Enemies. He doesn't praise McCarthy. It's all about the people opposed to him. Mm-hmm. So it's constantly on the attack. And in the book, he says that once we're done with the communists, we're going to go after the liberals. We're going to destroy them. So I think that is what the people around Trump would like to do when we're talking about a culture war, and when Trump refers to his political opponents as vermin. I think what you're doing is you're indicating that you don't just have political opponents, you have enemies who need to be wiped out.
So that's a great insight. The kind of anti-McCarthyism, right, as the then equivalent of anti-Trumpism, which has actually been a very successful way in which, if you watch Fox News, often many of the hosts, they never mention Donald Trump's name for the last few years. What they do is they bash constantly the people who are against him or against MAGA, against Republicans. It's a very effective technique. I want to make sure we have time to get to questions from the audience, by the way. So please do think of some questions for Jacob. But while we're doing that, I do want to ask about another interesting kind of personal part of the book, which is, you've sort of lived a little bit inside this world yourself, right? And you write in particular about one character that you worked with a long time at National Interest, of interest to me because of my time spent in Russia and looking at Russian relations, which is Dmitry Simes, who was the head of the then Nixon Center, which National Interest was part of. You write this sort of fascinating, tantalizing story about a guy who ultimately returned to Russia as a pro-Putin propagandist. Tell us a little bit about Dmitry Simes.
Well, during my tenure at the National Interest, I think people tended to overread. There's the constant. This is among a fringe of Washingtonians, obviously, but this idea that he was a Russian agent or something, I don't think so.
But you don't know so.
Well, I'm not. He's a highly intellectual figure, quite charismatic, as you know, and
who arranged the very first Donald Trump campaign speech about foreign policy in April of 2016.
Correct. And I met Trump at that event and was underwhelmed, as I wrote.
I attended it.
That's right. One thing I can't help remarking is, I met Trump, shook his hand and everything. I am perplexed why so many people are cowering before him. He's not actually that impressive in person, but I think there is a lot of opportunism. No, I think Dimitri's had a sincere congruence of interests with Trump. I think he believed a lot of it. I mean, he had, well, I shouldn't be putting words in his mouth, but anyway, yes, he has ended up in Russia and saying some things that I think are quite unfortunate.
The point is that you have observed at firsthand, really, this phenomenon. It's not some academic thing in books or, that happened in the United States 50 years ago, right? It's a very much real-time example, which brings us back to, just this past week, Tucker Carlson in Moscow, Donald Trump saying, go ahead, Russia, do whatever the hell you want if our allies don't pay up sufficiently. I'm curious, actually about this final question, which is all of this activity an actual threat inside the United States? Does it represent, at various times it would have been called an internal fifth column or something like that. There's a profoundly undemocratic or anti-democratic small d strain of our society that this is a history of in many ways. Okay, well, if it's undemocratic or anti-democratic, is it actually dangerous to democracy, or is it an element that a healthy democracy has to learn to live with and contain, and that's part of the price that we pay for having a First Amendment? What's your view?
I'm actually optimistic. I think a democracy can, strengthen its immune system. I am not paralyzed by fear that Donald Trump is going to win this election. I don't think ultimately that it's a winning message. Is there a problem? Yes. You look at the news today with Hunter Biden, that it looks like Russian intelligence was responsible for seeding a fabricated case against Hunter Biden. It's going to blow up in Congress. I don't think it's going to help the GOP. So yeah, that is reminiscent of the German Foreign Office before World War II, using one of the characters I talk about, George Sylvester Viereck, as an agent who was in close contact with senators and congressmen and disseminating essentially Nazi propaganda through the congressional franking system. And there is a problem, but I'm not convinced that we face a crisis.
Viereck is another one of those amazing characters in this book, by the way, who is in World War I and in World War II, an apologist for very different German governments.
Well, because he venerated both Kaiser Wilhelm and Adolf Hitler, both of whom he met and wrote about. I mean, he's one of these curious figures in American history, and Rachel Maddow writes about him too in her new book.
Yeah, no, if you've read Prequel or you're interested in that, I think both of these go together very well. If I was the Amazon recommendation engine, of course, I would tell you, I would recommend that you buy all your books at Politics and Prose. But, if I were to be a human recommendation engine, I would say those two are very complementary books. Why don't we go now to questions? I think we have a microphone, so just raise your hands and we'll give you the mic. Please do... tell us your name and make it a question. Thank you.
My name is Richard. You've touched on this already, but it's impossible to imagine Trump is aware of any of the historical material in your book. So my question is he an outlier, or is it a truism that at least initially all authoritarians are born and not made?
Well, this is a treacherous question because, you look at, there are historians now who argue that, for example, Adolf Hitler was a social construct of the society more than he was anything original. In Trump's case, and I don't think that he's Adolf Hitler. I'm not trying to. This is where we get it. We get into difficult territory. I think Trump. I believe in the importance of the individual in history, ultimately, and in accident. And Trump does have these consummate brand salesman abilities. So I think he constructed himself. I think if anyone is a construct, it is Donald Trump. He has created an image in which people can invest their hopes, and that's what they're doing. I don't know if that answers sufficiently, but...
What about the question of the historical antecedents? Do you think Donald Trump is aware of any of them?
I mean, allegedly, he had Mein Kampf next to his bedside. I don't know. I don't think Trump has really ever cracked a book. That's not how he works. But that again,
So you just kept it there to impress the ladies? I mean,
I leave that to.
By the way, that was from Ivana Trump's divorce testimony, right? I think.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, certainly possible.
Okay.
Jacob, congratulations on your book. How do you deal with the disaster in Iraq in your book? One could argue that Trump, Tucker, numerous others who are opposed to U.S. aid to Ukraine today might see the issue differently or might make different arguments if we had not had the disaster in Iraq under George W. Bush. Tucker, for instance, supported the Iraq War during that era, and it was an invasion against an authoritarian dictator. And so certainly you can't say that Tucker is opposed to all. You can't say that Tucker is in love with all dictators, and I don't. He's been very critical of Xi Jinping. Almost everybody on the right is very critical of Xi Jinping in a way that some may not be of Putin. And in fact, I think criticism and denunciation of China is probably one of the few bipartisan activities in D.C. But going back to the Iraq War, you look at people like Tucker, people like J.D. Vance, who actually served in the military, contrary to lots of Republicans who advocated for the war. Do you not think that that what they're saying today is more of a practical reaction? It may be an overreaction to the disaster, and hence Trump came to power announcing that he wanted no more stupid, endless wars in the Middle East. I don't think that slogan would have resonated if we did not have Iraq. And so I'm curious how you deal with the Iraq issue in your book.
I deal with it head on, which is.
I would expect no less.
That was a very restrained question from you, by the way.
I have more if there's time.
What I do not create some scenario where I suddenly exculpate all the never-Trumpers for their sins of the past, which is that many of the never-Trumpers were neoconservatives and were gung-ho for the Iraq War, which was obviously based both on lies, as Trump pointed out in his South Carolina primary.
Of course, he was also for it before he was against it.
Wow. But my point is that the neocons, I believe, did open the door to the rise of Trump and this movement. And is J.D. Vance, are they wrong? Josh Hawley, are they wrong about the Iraq War? No. But what's happened is they've gone overboard. They were not making distinctions. Now, they call themselves foreign policy realists. But what's realistic? Is it realistic to abandon Ukraine, which is fighting for itself, which is not demanding American soldiers, which is simply asking for support? How is that analogous to the Iraq War? I don't think it is. I think it's more analogous that the Russians are in the position that we were in Afghanistan, where they're being hit by locals. Now, obviously, the parallels are different. I'm not trying to compare the Taliban to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are actually trying to fight for their own liberty. And I don't think that as many Republicans would be as hostile to Ukraine absent Donald Trump's longstanding hostility to American intervention abroad. And I think that's what's driving this.
Well, and that is a big theme in the book, by the way. I would, again, recommend, because I think it's an important part of your argument, actually. No, let's get someone else to have a chance, and then we can come back.
Following up on that, actually, hostility to Ukraine and hostility to intervention abroad, how much of it is that versus trying to be on Putin's good side for all sorts of nefarious reasons?
This is, I could give you my. It's difficult to know, and it gets into conspiracy. I think you know, I'm not an expert on Putin's ties, whatever Putin and Trump's ties are. I can tell you that Trump has been intellectually consistent in his views. He has argued even during the Soviet Union and from 87 on, and then the Playboy interview he gave in 1990, he's always called for some kind of rapprochement with Russia and the Soviet Union. So I'm less inclined to go down the rabbit hole than some people are.
By the way, that 1989, I think it's actually a 1990 interview with Playboy.
Right.
Highly recommend that. It is like a Rosetta Stone to the foreign policy views of Donald Trump. And interestingly, in that interview, he criticizes Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union at that time, for not being strong enough, and praises the leaders of China for Tiananmen Square. Because this theme of strength is one that comes through even then. It's actually kind of notable and really interesting. All right, we have time for a few more questions. Before we get to the repeats, why don't we go here? How
Jacob, I've been interested in Orbanism, Orbán, and how self-consciously the man seems to be kind of appealing to these people you're writing about in this book. Have there been other autocrats like Orbán who've kind of like figured out how to like throw the bait in the water and kind of like set up this amazing relationship he's developed with people like Ron DeSantis and a lot of other people? I mean, I almost felt like Ron DeSantis was trying to recreate Hungary and Florida, you know?
The closest, I suppose,
it's a lot warmer.
would be Shanghai Shek. I mean, you had the China lobby in the 1950s. But more recently, actually, as seen as heroes at least, Pinochet set up a lobbying operation in Washington that actually the Justice Department, using the Foreign Agent Act, cracked down on. One of Bill Buckley's associates named Marvin Liebman had set up this whole lobbying effort for Chile that turned out to be illegal. And then in the 1980s, I talk about Jonas Savimbi, who became a hero for the right, also engaged a PR firm here in Washington that included Paul Manafort and Roger Stone.
Because time is a full circle. We are just about out of it. If you both wanted to have quick follow-ups, we can do that. It's up to you.
How surprised will both of you be if Trump wins?
Jacob here is a model of calm.
I would be surprised. I mean, because I think that he has sold this product successfully once, but has been unable to do so again. But would I be thunderstruck? No. I mean, it's happened once before, and it's certainly possible. But I think that in 2016, Trump was vastly underestimated. I don't think that's going to occur again.
Could you tell me how you deal with the China question? I know you mentioned Asia first, but specifically on the people you consider isolationists on the right. Whether obviously they would disagree, but many of them actually do not have any affinity for in fact, probably the biggest dictator in the world, which is Xi Jinping, arguably far more important than Putin. So how does that fit into your thesis?
Are you talking about in the 1950s?
No, so aside from the fact that Trump likes to go around saying he is very good friends with Xi Jinping, I don't believe anybody else on the right, including all of those people who oppose U.S. aid to Ukraine, I don't believe any of those people have any affinity for Xi Jinping. And so how does that fit into your thesis if, the right has this inherent love for autocrats?
Well, it's the the autocrats that I'm looking at from the China case has always been an exception for the right. And it's still a communist society. And I think that it's interesting. You see that distinction made today. I asked someone who's an fervent anti-communist, former editor of the American Conservative. He said, well, Putin's Russia is not communist. So that's the difference. I think that does linger on. However, I would say that if Trump were president, he's been equivocal on defending Taiwan, and he might well tear up the alliance system with both Japan and South Korea. So I think, at least in Trump's case, all bets would be off.
But probably not because he loves dictators, but just, as you said earlier, he has this inherent hostility toward engaging in armed conflict. And so his first instinct would be to find some sort of a deal and not pay for people's defense.
I think it's a little more complicated than that. As Susan was saying, the crackdown in Tiananmen Square, I think he likes the stability that dictators provide, and I think he likes working with them man to man, so to speak. And he finds it easier. He doesn't like dealing with an obstreperous public. He wants to command, issue orders, and have them executed. So that's what he admires. It seems to be like, King Jong-un, the same thing. Talking about exchanging love letters and so forth. There's something demented going on there.
And what a note to end this conversation on. I want to thank, these are all great questions and a terrific, really stimulating book. And I think it's a really important one right now. I hope that a lot of people get a chance to dig into it. So, Jacob, thank you for writing it. And the fact that you did so unbelievably speedily, we won't tell, okay?
Thank you, Susan, and thank you everyone for coming.